Claire stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables with the precision of someone trying to focus on anything but her thoughts. Outside, the sun had already set, casting the suburban street in shadows. The faint hum of traffic from the highway drifted through the open window, blending with the occasional laughter from the living room. Her stepson, Liam, and his best friend, Ethan, had taken over the couch again. Their voices, lively and filled with the easy confidence of youth, carried through the house. Claire often felt like a ghost in her own home, a spectator to their world. Liam was 22, brimming with energy and always surrounded by friends. Claire, at 39, felt a million miles away from their orbit. As she finished preparing dinner, she caught a glimpse of Ethan through the doorway. He was leaning back on the couch, his long legs stretched out and his hands behind his head. There was something about him, his easy grin, the way he carried himself, that always drew her attention, though she'd never admit it out loud. He was Liam's best friend. After all, he had been coming around for years. But recently, Claire had noticed things she hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered when he spoke to her. The way his smile seemed to hold a secret. Shaking her head, she pushed the thoughts aside. It's nothing, she told herself. He's just friendly, that's all. Dinner's ready, she called, her voice cutting through the chatter. Liam appeared first, his dark hair a messy tangle as usual. He was still in his workout clothes, his hoodie slung over one shoulder. Ethan followed, his striking blue eyes meeting hers briefly before he offered a casual "Thanks, Claire." The three of them sat at the small dining table, the conversation flowing easily between Liam and Ethan. Claire mostly listened, chiming in occasionally when asked a direct question. She watched the two young men banter, feeling a mix of amusement and envy at their carefree attitudes. Life seemed so simple for them, so light. As the evening wore on, Claire excused herself and headed to her room. She left the two of them in the living room, their laughter echoing faintly down the hallway. She tried to focus on a book, but her mind wandered. That same feeling, the one she couldn't quite name, crept in again. A few days later, Claire was startled by the sound of the doorbell. It was late, well past 10 p.m., and she hadn't been expecting anyone. She padded to the door in her slippers, her brow furrowed with curiosity. When she opened it, Ethan stood on the porch, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his leather jacket. The porch light cast shadows on his face, making his sharp features look even more defined. "Ethan?" she asked, surprised. "Is everything okay?" He gave her a sheepish smile. "Liam said he'd be back late and told me to hang out here until he got home." "Hope that's all right." Claire hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Of course. Come in." Ethan entered, his presence filling the quiet house. Claire realized how strange it felt to have him there without Liam. She offered him a drink, and they ended up in the kitchen, talking about nothing in particular. The conversation flowed easily, much to her surprise. Ethan had a way of making her laugh, of making her feel at ease in a way she hadn't felt in years. "You know," he said at one point, leaning against the counter, "you're not like most people I know." Claire raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that a compliment or an insult?" "Definitely a compliment." His smile was warm, disarming. "You're different, in a good way." She felt a blush creeping up her neck and quickly looked away. "You should probably save that charm for someone your own age." Ethan chuckled, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her pulse quicken. "Maybe," he said, his voice low, "but I mean it." Claire couldn't shake the way Ethan had looked at her that night. His words, though casual on the surface, seemed to carry a deeper weight, a meaning she couldn't quite decipher, or perhaps didn't want to. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. After all, Ethan was just a young man being polite. Charming, yes, but polite. Still, the memory lingered. The following weekend, Liam invited Ethan over again. As he often did, Claire tried to keep her focus on the laundry and the list of errands she needed to tackle. But every now and then, she'd hear Ethan's laugh from the living room. It wasn't just the sound of it but the way it seemed to wrap around her, pulling her thoughts back to him. When she passed through the living room to grab a glass of water, she caught Ethan's eye. He smiled, The kind of smile that made her heart skip a beat despite herself. Liam, oblivious as always, was focused on a video game, shouting instructions at the screen. "You're awfully quiet today," Ethan said as she walked by. Claire paused, startled. "Oh, just busy," she replied quickly, gesturing toward the laundry basket in her hands. "You should take a break," he said, his tone teasing. "Join us. We could use a referee." She laughed nervously. "I think I'll leave that to you two. I wouldn't want to get in the way." Ethan's gaze lingered as she left the room, and she could feel it even after she'd turned the corner. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, scolding herself for the warmth spreading through her chest. This was ridiculous. He was Liam's friend, practically family in a way. She needed to get a grip. It was close to midnight when Claire finally climbed into bed. The house had gone quiet. The sounds of Liam and Ethan's laughter replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. She was just beginning to drift off when a knock at her bedroom door startled her awake. "Claire?" Ethan's voice was soft, almost hesitant. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Ethan? Is everything okay?" The door opened slowly, and there he was, standing in the dim light of the hallway. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said, his voice low. "I just couldn't sleep." Claire frowned, confused. "Is Liam still awake?" Ethan shook his head. "He crashed hours ago." She shifted, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that she was sitting in bed, her pajamas rumpled and her hair a mess. "You should probably head back to the living room," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Liam wouldn't like you being in here." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile, one that sent a shiver down her spine. "Liam doesn't have to know." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Claire's breath caught as he took a step closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. There was a warmth in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made it impossible for her to look away. "Ethan," she began, her voice faltering. "This isn't, I mean, we shouldn't." "I know," he said softly, his gaze steady, "but I can't stop thinking about you. About the way you look at me. Even when you don't realize it." Her heart was racing now, her mind screaming at her to tell him to leave, to put an end to this before it went any further. But her body betrayed her, rooted in place as he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. "I shouldn't be here," he said, almost to himself, "but I couldn't stay away." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air growing thick with tension. Claire's thoughts were a chaotic mess, a mix of guilt and desire warring for control. This was wrong, she knew that much, but the way he was looking at her, the way he made her feel, was unlike anything she'd experienced in years. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But before she could say more, the sound of footsteps in the hallway froze them both. The door creaked open, and there stood Liam, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. For a moment, none of them spoke. Claire's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure they could both hear it. She expected anger, confusion, anything but the calm expression Liam wore as he stepped further into the room and closed the door behind him. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, his tone measured. Claire scrambled for words, her mind racing. "Liam, this isn't." "It's fine," Liam said, cutting her off. His eyes flicked to Ethan, who was standing frozen by the bed. "I had a feeling something like this might happen." Claire stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" Liam shrugged, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I'm not blind, Claire. I've seen the way you two look at each other. I was just waiting to see if either of you would admit it." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Liam, you don't have to explain," Liam said, his tone almost amused. "Honestly, I don't mind. If anything, I'm curious." "Curious?" Claire echoed, her voice trembling. Liam stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Yeah, about how far you're willing to take this." Claire's heart pounded as Liam's words settled in the room. The tension was unbearable, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something she couldn't quite name. Her stepson's calm demeanor only added to the surreal nature of the moment. "Liam, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Liam tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Isn't it? Ethan shifted beside her, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. I think I should go, he murmured, stepping back toward the door. No, Liam said sharply, his gaze snapping to his friend. Stay. Ethan froze, his eyes flicking between Liam and Claire. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until Claire finally found her voice again. Liam, she said, her tone firmer now, whatever you think is happening here, we need to talk about this privately. But Liam didn't move. Instead, he walked to the other side of the room, pulling up a chair and sitting down with an air of quiet authority. No need, he said, I've already figured it out. Claire's chest tightened. Figured what out? That there's something between you two, he said simply, his eyes darting briefly to Ethan. And I'm not sure why. But I'm not angry about it. His words hit her like a wave, leaving her speechless. How could he be so calm, so nonchalant about something so wrong? She turned to Ethan, hoping he would say something to diffuse the situation. But he remained silent, his face a mask of uncertainty. This isn't right, Claire said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam, you have to understand that. Maybe it isn't, Liam replied, but that doesn't mean it has to end here. Claire's stomach churned at the implication. What are you saying? Liam leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm saying, maybe there's a way for all of us to get what we want. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. Liam, this isn't funny. Who said I was joking? Liam shot back, his gaze unwavering. You've been my best friend for years. Ethan, and Claire, well, she's important to me, too. I'm just saying we don't have to pretend anymore. Claire felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She had expected anger, confrontation, but not this. Liam, I don't think you understand what you're suggesting. Oh, I understand, he said, his tone firm, but the question is, do you? His words hung in the air, challenging her. Ethan stood awkwardly, clearly torn between leaving and staying. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Liam, this is your family. I don't want to mess that up. You're not messing anything up, Liam said with a shrug. If anything, you're making things interesting. Interesting? Claire repeated, her voice trembling with disbelief. This isn't a game, Liam. I know, he said, meeting her gaze, but maybe it doesn't have to be a disaster. Either. Claire couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt trapped, cornered by the intensity of Liam's words and the weight of Ethan's silence. Her mind raced, searching for a way to end this before it spiraled any further out of control. But then Liam stood, walking slowly to where Ethan was standing. Ethan, he said softly, his tone shifting to something almost tender. You've always been honest with me. So why stop now? Ethan hesitated, his eyes flicking to Claire before returning to Liam. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, Liam said, his voice steady. Just admit that you want this. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, fear, and a dangerous flicker of excitement she couldn't entirely suppress. Ethan finally spoke, his voice hesitant but resolute. I can't deny it, he said, his eyes on Liam. But this isn't right. Liam stepped closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Right and wrong aren't always clear. You know, sometimes it's about what feels right. Claire felt a shiver run through her. This has to stop, she said, her voice trembling. Before we do something we can't take back. But Liam turned to her, his expression softening. Claire, you've been alone for so long. Don't you think you deserve to feel alive again? His words struck a nerve, piercing through the walls she'd built around herself. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but she couldn't deny the truth in what he'd said. She had been lonely, yearning for something she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. Liam, are you sure about this? Liam nodded, his gaze steady. I've never been more sure of anything. What happened next unfolded in a blur. Words gave way to actions. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiling over. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear were crossed. leaving all three of them irrevocably changed. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the room. Claire lay still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Her chest felt heavy, a confusing mix of emotions swirling within her, guilt, exhilaration, and something else she couldn't quite name. She turned her head slightly and saw Ethan sitting by the window. His profile illuminated by the morning light. He was quiet, his gaze fixed on the world outside, a thoughtful expression on his face. There was a tenderness about the way he sat there, as though he, too, was lost in the gravity of what had transpired. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. Not really. Too much to think about. Claire sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Ethan, last night, she paused, searching for the right words. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his voice gentle. I know it was unexpected. That's one way to put it, she said, a faint laugh escaping her despite herself. Ethan crossed the room and sat down beside her, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. Claire, I don't regret it, he said, his eyes earnest. But I know this isn't simple. She looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. No, it's not, she admitted, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real. Later that day, the house was unusually quiet. Liam had left early in the morning, leaving behind a short note saying he'd gone for a run. Claire wasn't sure if his absence was intentional, a way of giving her and Ethan space, or if it was just coincidence. Either way, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Ethan stayed, helping her tidy up the kitchen and fix a broken cabinet door. His presence a comfort despite the unspoken tension between them. As they worked, their conversations were light, almost normal, but there was a newfound closeness in the way they interacted. It was as if the barriers that had always stood between them had been quietly dismantled. Claire, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Do you think Liam knows about what we feel? She hesitated, her hand pausing mid-motion as she wiped the counter. I think Liam sees more than he lets on, she said carefully. He's always been perceptive. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. I don't want to hurt him. He's like a brother to me. I don't want that either, Claire said firmly, but we need to figure out what this is before it gets any more complicated. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. What I feel for you, it's not complicated. It's real, but I'll respect whatever you decide. Her heart tightened at his words, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. She wanted to tell him how much he'd made her feel alive again. How he'd awakened something in her that she thought she'd lost forever. But the fear of what this could mean, for Liam, for all of them, held her back. That evening, Liam returned home, his expression calm but unreadable. He greeted them casually, as though nothing had changed. But there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made Claire's stomach twist. Did you have a good run? She asked, trying to keep her tone light. It was fine, Liam replied, his gaze flicking briefly to Ethan. Cleared my head. The three of them sat in the living room, the atmosphere charged with unspoken words. Claire felt as though she were balancing on a knife's edge, every glance and every word carefully measured. Finally, Liam broke the silence. Ethan, can I talk to Claire alone for a minute? Ethan hesitated but nodded. Of course, he said, standing. I'll be in the kitchen. Once he was gone, Liam turned to Claire, his expression softer than she expected. Claire, he began, his voice steady. I want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. Her eyes widened in surprise. Liam, I know what's going on, he said, cutting her off gently, and I'm not here to judge you. I want you to know that I understand. Tears pricked at her eyes as she looked at him, overwhelmed by his calm acceptance. Liam, I never meant for this to happen. I know, he said, reaching for her hand, but maybe it was meant to happen anyway. Over the next few days, the three of them found a strange, unspoken rhythm. Liam didn't bring up the subject again, but there was an unspoken understanding between him, Claire, and Ethan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but somehow, It felt like they were finding their way through the complexity of their emotions. Claire spent more time with Ethan, their connection growing deeper with each passing day. He made her laugh, reminded her what it felt like to be seen and appreciated in a way she hadn't experienced in years. And though the guilt still lingered, she couldn't deny the happiness he brought her. As for Liam, his relationship with both Claire and Ethan seemed to shift in subtle ways. He was more open, more honest, and there was a quiet maturity in the way he handled the situation. It wasn't conventional, but it worked, for now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire stood on the back porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. Ethan joined her, his hand slipping into hers without a word. "We can't keep this up forever," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I know," he replied, "but I'm willing to fight for this. For you." Her heart swelled at his words. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They still had a long way to go, and there were no guarantees. But in that moment, standing together under the fading light of the day, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way. Days turned into weeks, and Claire found herself caught in a delicate balancing act. Her connection with Ethan deepened with every shared glance, every quiet moment stolen away from the rest of the world. Yet, her bond with Liam grew more complex. He remained calm, even supportive, but his quiet acceptance carried an undercurrent of unspoken tension. One evening, as Claire sat in the garden, Liam joined her. The air was cool, and the scent of blooming jasmine filled the space between them. "Claire," he began softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "have you thought about what you really want?" Her heart sank. She had been avoiding the question for days, too afraid of the consequences to face it directly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like I'm caught between two worlds. I don't want to hurt either of you." Liam gave her a small, understanding smile. "Sometimes, doing what's right for yourself is the hardest choice. But it's the only way forward." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You've been so kind, Liam, more than I deserve. You deserve happiness," he said simply. "I just hope you choose it." That night, Ethan came to her room. He seemed nervous, his usual confidence dimmed by the weight of their situation. "I can't keep pretending like this is enough," he said, his voice trembling. "Claire, I love you. I don't care about the complications or what anyone else thinks. But I need to know if you feel the same." His words hit her like a wave. And for a moment, she couldn't speak. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice breaking, "you've brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing. I feel more alive with you than I have in years. But this isn't just about us. It's about Liam, too." Ethan nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "I know, but I can't stay in limbo forever. I need you to decide. Claire, do we take the leap together? Or do we let this go?" The next morning, Claire found Liam in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. She joined him, the tension in her chest almost unbearable. "Liam," she began, her voice trembling, "I've made a decision." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And? I'm letting Ethan go," she said, her voice cracking. "This isn't fair to you. It's not fair to any of us." Liam's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I can't let this ruin what we have. Liam, you're my family. I love you, and I won't let anything come between us." Liam pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "You're stronger than you think. Claire, I'm proud of you." Ethan came by later that day, his expression filled with a mix of hope and dread. Claire met him outside, the crisp autumn air wrapping around them as they stood together. "I've made my choice," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Ethan, I care about you more than I can say. But this, it isn't right. I have to let you go." Ethan's face fell, but he nodded, his jaw tightening. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'll never forget what we had." "Neither will I," she whispered. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. And then he turned and walked away. Claire watched him go, her heart breaking with every step he took. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet reflection. Claire focused on rebuilding her relationship with Liam. determined to put the past behind them. They talked openly, sharing their fears and hopes. And slowly, the cracks in their bond began to heal. As for Ethan, he stopped visiting, choosing to put distance between himself and the life he had shared with them. Claire missed him terribly, but she knew it was for the best. Their connection had been real, but it wasn't meant to last. Months later, Claire found herself standing in the same garden where so much had changed. The air was warm, the scent of jasmine filling the air once again. Liam joined her, his presence a comforting weight at her side. "Do you regret it?" he asked. His voice quiet. Claire shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "No, I think everything happened the way it was meant to. I've learned a lot, about myself. About what I want." Liam nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You're stronger now." "So are you," she replied, reaching for his hand. "We both are." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't define her. She was ready to move forward, stronger and wiser than before.